After you've identified a personal story that matters, it's time to uncover the mindset behind it, the hidden way of thinking that shapes society's choices and harms. A strong mindset isn't just any opinion or belief, it has to be the invisible engine behind real world problems, and your speech is about exposing it. So in this video, I want to go through what I think are the 5 essential criteria every strong mindset should meet and examples of where I think students oftentimes go wrong. So let's take a look over here and start going through them one by one. So you'll see here, this is the problem mindset, and I think these are the 5 criteria. Simple and specific, serious implications, pervasive, unexpected and original, and then timely and relevant. And I'll go through each of these 5, and then I'll talk about the iterative loop that I think developing this speech really, or developing an OO speech usually entails. So let's jump in with simple and specific. Key question you got to ask here is just, can you clearly say the mindset in one sentence without being vague? This is a great test I always do with students. Is oftentimes I ask them, what is your topic? Explain your mindset. And they start talking for over a minute. And if it takes you that long to explain your topic, you don't know what you're trying to say. So simplicity isn't about dumbing down your message. It means being able to get to the core of your message in one sentence that's clear, direct, and specific. So if your mindset is too vague, if it relies on complex phrasing or jargon, or it requires too many sentences to explain, then it's just not compelling. And that is a sign to me that you actually really haven't figured out exactly what you're trying to say. And so again, the best test of whether or not you have a good understanding of your speech is whether you can have one very straightforward sentence that conveys to me what the problematic mindset is, and through that, it would be very obvious what we should be thinking instead. Think about on God's speech, how straightforward it is. The idea that when we are confronted with tragedy, our response of turning to thoughts and prayers is bad, and instead we should turn to action. Very straightforward. So here are some examples of topics that are too vague. When people say, we just don't care enough, or society ignores what's important, or we don't have enough urgency. Notice all of those are so vague. Like, what do we not have enough urgency about? There's plenty of instances I can think of where people have a lot of urgency about things. What do you mean society ignores what's important? By the way, pet peeve / really bad writing practice in OO, never say society. What is society, man? Just say people, right? Just say, or we. I think we is actually the best way. Like, when confronted with tragedy, we turn to thoughts and prayers as opposed to society, which is like an ill-defined thing, right? Anyway, so all of these just don't really make a lot of sense. Like, what do we not care enough about? So that's one way that I think people go down a bad rabbit hole. The other way is your topic is just way too convoluted. Like, look at this. It says, due to the standards for cultural belonging being manipulated by both the greater society and one's own community. So pause, like, what does it mean for greater society and one's own community to manipulate standards of cultural belonging? Like, what standards are we talking about? I don't even know what that means. That's so abstract and jargony and academic. But anyways, because of that, people are often pressured into extremes, either assimilate by erasing one's cultural heritage or exaggerate their ethnic identity, unknowingly supporting stereotypes. When caught in this predicament, people are left stuck in the middle, never being enough of one and too much of the other. In trying to escape this situation, they often project identities that don't reflect their truth, limiting identity growth and deepening a sense of cultural imposter syndrome. So just whoa, like, what are we saying here? Notice it's very complex. If I were to try to explain to you what that topic just said, I wouldn't be able to do it in a straightforward way. I'm guessing you're confused too. And I'm sure to the writer, like, there were a lot of good ideas in here, but notice that is so much more complicated than saying, when confronted with tragedy, we turn to thoughts and prayers instead of action. That's so much more straightforward. So this is the checklist that you should be going through as you're checking your topic for this part. First, can your mindset be clearly understood in one simple sentence? A great check here is ask friends and family. Second, I avoid overly convoluted explanations of the mindset that stretch for multiple sentences and contain multiple tangential ideas. That by the way, like, there are probably 5 different topics within this as opposed to one. I avoid overly vague generalizations like people just don't care or society is broken. I use precise and specific language. So I think those are the 4 things that you should be checking here to make sure that you have passed this bar. Next is serious implications. And I think students on face think they're not struggling with this one, but let me go over why I think they are. So I think the question you got to be asking is, does this mindset cause real harm in the world. And I think the key word here actually isn't harm. Like maybe I should have titled this root cause, but it's really cause. I think oftentimes people think that they are articulating big impacts about things that are going on in the world. The problem is they're not proving that their mindset is the root cause of it. So let me talk about this. Key point is a strong mindset needs to be the root cause of real societal harms, as opposed to just like annoyances. Sometimes I see this as an issue, so I do want to flag this of sometimes people do present problems, like procrastination is a classic one, where the links to real societal harms are just going to be really tenuous, and like most of the things that you're talking about are like annoyances, like you do worse on your homework or tests because of procrastination. That's not like a real societal harm, right? It's more of an annoyance. It's not fundamentally in a serious way hurting people or holding society back. So it should explain, your mindset needs to explain why problems continue to exist, not just describe those problems. So here's a really big common mistake I see here. Like really want to sit on this one because I see this all the time, especially with underclassmen. Let's call it assuming mindset from outcome. Another way to think about this though is you are confusing causes and effects. Instead of giving me a mindset that is a cause of problems, you are instead just sort of vaguely describing effects. Let's jump in. So this occurs when you observe a negative outcome in society, think poverty, climate change, and action on gun control, so on and so forth, and you assume that the cause must be a collective societal mindset, like something like apathy, ignorance, or fear, but you have never actually sufficiently proven that mindset exists or caused the issue. So the big problem here is it's an inversion of causality. You're saying this bad thing exists, so it must be because of how we think. But that's not how causality works. Like correlation isn't causation, and the mindset isn't the problem unless you've proven it. So your job is to start with a clearly defined mindset, a way of thinking, and argue that it shapes our behaviors, institutions, and decisions, instead of starting with societal harms like poverty, climate change, book bans, etc., and then retrofitting a mindset to explain it. That is the place where we get to really vague, generic, or unprovable claims, and that often makes the argument feel thin or circular. And that's really bad. Now, the way that you do this is you need to fundamentally think about, how do I prove that somebody has embodied a mindset? Well, starting with the problem existing is not the way you do that. Me seeing poverty or climate change doesn't prove that we're apathetic. It doesn't prove that apathy is the root cause of the problem. Like, what if we all really, really cared about poverty, and in fact, we're passing billions of dollars to try to solve poverty, but it's just that the solutions we're passing are fundamentally not working? Like, the existence of poverty doesn't prove we're apathetic. There could be lots of other reasons why poverty exists. So instead, you need to think about, how do I establish mindsets? And that's oftentimes the way that people talk about issues. So how do our political leaders talk about a problem, right? How does the words that they use or the attitudes that are behind those words convey some deeper mindset? Or look at news headlines. How is an event like what's going on, some pressing problem in the world today, how is that discussed, and how does that reveal an implicit mindset in something as basic as the headlines that are articulating that? Or you could think about the way that your friends and family talk about things. Like, it's oftentimes in those statements that people make, the way that they're discussing issues, that you get the hidden mindsets behind them. It's the iceberg behind it. But you can't just say, oh, look, somebody didn't go out and help homeless people, therefore we hate homeless people. That's a logical fallacy. So let's look at some examples. Flawed one. There's still systemic racism, so clearly we haven't done enough to care about racial equity. Notice that is just starting with the effect, and then it is assuming that therefore we don't care about racial equity. Let's look at an improved version that actually focuses on a mindset. Imagine a topic articulated as, we often embrace color blindness as a virtue, but that mindset actually prevents us from directly addressing systemic racism. So we're starting from a mindset, the idea of we shouldn't care about race, like we should be colorblind in our decisions. That's a mindset that people have. And then from there, you get to an impact. Or look at this. This is gun violence is rampant, so America doesn't value children. America not valuing children is not a mindset people have. Like, people aren't going around being like, I hate kids. I mean, maybe some are, but like, that's not a rampant mindset. Instead, look at this. It says we've normalized an action through a mindset of fatalism, believing that change is impossible, and that mindset numbs us to solutions. By the way, you're never going to say mindset in your speech, like never say that. Instead, the mindset here is change is impossible. So you're going to start with that building block, and that's going to prove, or that's going to lead to us not taking any action on gun violence. Here's another one. Mental health is still stigmatized, so people clearly don't want to talk about it. And an improved version would be our cultural mindset of emotional perfectionism, the need to appear constantly okay, drives us to hide mental health struggles. Again, this one's a little generic, but I'm trying to show you like the kernel of the mindset here is the idea that we need to appear constantly okay. That is the mindset. And then the effect is we hide mental health struggles. Hiding mental health struggles is not a mindset. Nobody is like, oh man, we should all hide mental health struggles. So you need to ask, what is the mindset that is leading to that? So it's about thinking in a deeper way, what is the root cause of these problems? So here's the checklist you should have. Make sure your topic is a mindset that is the root cause of problematic actions rather than just vaguely describing an effect. This is by far the biggest one I see. Next, you got to prove your mindset leads to problems rather than just assuming it does. This is kind of part and parcel of the first checkpoint, but I want to put it there. Of oftentimes people are like, no, I have a sentence that says X mindset caused this problem. But it's like, yeah, but that wasn't proven, right? Like you just did the correlation rather than causation thing where you just said like, look, school shootings exist, therefore we don't care about children, without actually proving to me that the lack of care about children is what propelled our inaction on gun violence. And then you gotta, I put this last one in there, you make sure the problem isn't, or the mindset isn't just annoying, like make sure it actually has real societal harms. That's what that final one's getting at. Normally, students don't struggle with that. Next is pervasiveness. The key question you gotta ask here is, do regular, well-meaning people hold this mindset instead of just extreme or clearly bad people? Sometimes I see people arrive at mindsets that really would only be embodied by the most radical, extreme people in society. If all of your examples are just talking about one group of people on one side of the political spectrum doing the most extreme, heinous, hateful actions, it's not a pervasive speech. So you got to make sure your mindset is common among regular, well-intentioned people, not just extremists or villains, right? So it should appear in everyday life systems or language. So you want to make sure that that mindset is something that's embedded in politics and culture and interpersonal relationships, not just the radical fringes. And that's what makes it worth addressing. And it's really going to draw the audience in. You want the audience to be sitting there being like, wow, like, no, I've totally thought that before. As opposed to being like, of course, somebody who goes and commits hate crimes against immigrants is a bad person. Like, you don't want your speech to only apply to that latter category. You want it to be something that, yes, will lead to probably, like there will be a point in your speech. Think about On God's national finalist speech where it builds to people committing hate crimes against Sikhs. But that mindset absolutely is something that regular, common, everyday people could embody instead of just, people who are going to commit hate crimes. So here are examples, right? Our hatred of immigrants has caused us to justify horrific acts of violence against innocent people, or maybe too many of us believe in the superiority of some races over others, causing us to accept systems of oppression. Like both of those are topics that are just fundamentally the judge is not going to feel any sort of connection to it. They're not going to feel like it's something that they embody. And so they're going to feel disconnected. They're going to feel like, well, duh, somebody doing that would be bad. It'd be like you standing up and being like, did you know terrorism is bad? It's like, well, yes, like everyone's going to agree with that. So checklist here, make sure the mindset shows up in everyday life, not just in extreme examples. And make sure, I think this is another good litmus test is like, it should be something that you've believed at some point or you've seen in people that you know. All right, let's go to the next one. Unexpected and original. And these two can sometimes be in tension. The big question that you're asking here is, does your topic offer an insight that feels fresh and original instead of just being obvious and cliche? And the reason these are in tension is because if you go too far in the unexpected original category, where you're like, here's a mindset that like nobody has thought about, then it's probably not going to be something that's pervasive. But you got to make sure that you're not picking a mindset that's so pervasive that it's just going to feel so obvious and cliche that nobody is really going to feel moved by it. So they don't have to be in tension, but there is definitely a delicate art here. Great mindsets should feel unexpected and original. They should avoid making very obvious statements like hate is bad that do not offer any new insights. And you can do that in a number of ways. You can challenge norms and assumptions we've accepted without question. You can put a new spin on an idea we might already agree with. You could make us think of a mindset that we haven't given much consideration to before. But ultimately, you want the audience to say, I've never thought of it that way, but now I can unsee it. But again, even though they're going to think that, it still has to be something pervasive that they would embody. And notice that at the end of the day, right, when you look at national champions, if you start studying all the NSDA national finalists, a lot of those mindsets, especially on the national champions, are going to, at their core, when you distill them to their essence, feel a little bit obvious. So you should be asking yourself, what are these speakers doing to make their speech feel really unexpected, fresh, and original? On God's speech at the beginning of the year was a very vague speech about complacency. And it just didn't feel that fresh or original. It felt kind of bland. It felt kind of stock. It felt kind of generic. And luckily, there were so many other attributes that On God had. He was an incredibly dynamic public speaker. He had great delivery. He had a really powerful personal story. And so it carried him through most of that first semester. But he knew going into the second semester, as we're getting to the big end of year tournaments, especially nationals, that he was going to have to totally rework that topic to make it feel a lot more fresh and original, to make it just feel a lot stronger. And so that's how we arrived at Thoughts and Prayers by the end of the year. It just felt like a much more specific articulation that felt a lot fresher and more relevant, which we'll talk about in just a moment, as opposed to that really vague cliche version of the speech of just like, we are too complacent, which just doesn't quite feel unexpected enough. Here are some weak examples, right? Like hate is bad, or procrastination is bad, or obsession with perfectionism is bad. And by the way, these are all speeches that I am absolutely just going to ban. These are speeches that freshmen and sophomores every year pitch to me. The three big ones are procrastination, perfectionism, and our obsession with success. All three of those do not work. They're just way too bland and generic. There are other issues with them that I'm happy to go over, but you just got to trust me. I've seen like 5 students do those topics every single year for over 10 years, and never have they been successful. And then, we need to learn to be less judgmental of others. Like all of these are a little bit too obvious. So checklist here is: mindset should challenge something commonly accepted or unexamined, or flip a core assumption. And then your mindset just needs to feel fresh and original, not obvious. I think that second one is really the big important one there. And let's move to the final criteria, which is about being timely and relevant. And I think this is a secret sauce that can just make your speech stand out and get over that hump of feeling like this vague, vacuous, generalizable, timeless, original oratory where you're just talking about these really generalized harms like addiction and poverty, and it just doesn't feel relevant to our world today. The question you got to ask is this mindset clearly connected to what's happening right now? Your mindset has to connect to what's happening now, like in headlines and policy and technology or culture, and it should feel urgently current, like something that needs to be talked about today. So the more you're drawing directly from recent policies or legislation or things going on in our culture, the more the stakes will feel immediate and real. And let me give some examples here. On God, actually, in his before Harvard, which is like the most competitive tournament in original oratory besides nationals, we really wanted to rework his speech heading into that tournament. And so we actually completely rewrote his intro. We rewrote a bunch of other stuff in his speech too, but his introduction paragraph completely changed. This was a tournament in February, and it was the week right after the Super Bowl. And so that week, we wrote an introduction that was entirely about the Super Bowl, and it was about the Kansas Chiefs getting completely blown out in that Super Bowl game, and the song Like a Prayer was played by Bon Jovi at some point. And so it was just like a super funny way of establishing the they need more than just thoughts and prayers, they need a defensive line, something like that, right? I think that was the punchline that landed really well. And that was just an example of a way in which, like, all of a sudden, this mindset just felt so relevant and timely. Like, think of being a judge at that tournament. The Super Bowl is top of mind. It literally just happened that week. And then you're going in and a student is giving a speech about that. And so we totally revamped his speech before the Harvard tournament. He ended up winning that. And same with nationals. We rewrote his speech 2 weeks before the tournament so that every example felt really fresh and new, because we knew going into June that, which is when nationals occurred, that if we still had the intro about the Super Bowl, it would feel like way too outdated by that point. Nobody was thinking about the Super Bowl in June. So that's one example. Now, obviously, I'm not saying go rewrite your speech 1 to 2 weeks before a tournament. I don't always think that's good, but you do got to make sure that your speech feels timely and relevant. You can't just have generalized harms and impacts like poverty or addiction or like burnout in people's jobs or climate change. Those are like big ones that are coming to mind. That and at no point you have things that really feel rooted in the pressing issues confronting our world today, this year. Another example I could give, one of the students I was working with, in his speech, he had developed this speech in the summer of 2024. And then in the fall, some of his examples, think about this. This was before the 2024 election. Some of his examples were around like things that were said about Kamala Harris. And so he had some examples in there that were linked to that. By the time we rolled around to like preparation for state and nationals in April and then May and June, an example about Kamala Harris felt so outdated. Like that was eons ago. By this point, Donald Trump is president again. Like the issues that are confronting our society have totally changed. Like something said about Kamala Harris months ago just felt like it was from a completely different lifetime. So we took it out. And so go watch the national finalist speeches, and oftentimes they really feel like they were written like they give you the illusion of like, wow, this felt like it was written this month. And that's the best feeling that you can give. So you got to make sure your mindset ties to recent news, cultural trends, public conversations. Got to make sure you can point to examples from this year, not just the past. And it should feel urgent, like it needs to be talked about now. So those are the 5 criteria. It's hard to get all 5 of these criteria. Trust me. Like if you can check all these boxes, your speech is pretty much like ready to go, and you'll be in a really good place where it'll basically write itself. So don't be in dismay if you're struggling with some of these. But I do want to say that if you want to compete at the highest levels, getting to all 5 of these is really, really important. And the final bit I want to leave us on is talking about what I see as the developing a topic iterative loop. And this is the hardest in original oratory. I think arriving at the topic in OO is the hardest of any speech event. Maybe with the exception of info. Info and OO are both very difficult. But it's hard because it's hard to get both a personal story that really is impactful and matters and get a mindset that meets all those criteria. It's like getting something where both of those overlap on the Venn diagram is difficult. So this is the loop I typically recommend for students is you start off with a personal story like we talked about in the last video. Then you go to try to connect it to a mindset. You then got to test that mindset. Does it meet the criteria? And very rarely, like no student gets through all 3 of those on the first go, right? Like even On God didn't, right? His speech had so many iterations and edits throughout the year. I see going through this process, though, as kind of getting through a first attempt at trying to figure out what you are trying to say, and then it hits no, and so then you got to start the process over. But I think actually restart is probably a bad word here. I don't see it as throwing everything out and starting from scratch. Instead, you have something that drew you to that topic, and so you should follow that. And so think about On God, right? At the core of his speech, he knew he wanted to talk about the issues that were confronting his Sikh community. He knew there was something around his dad experiencing discrimination, being called Osama bin Laden, and not taking action, and seeing his community not really rising to that occasion. And that was the heart of what he wanted to talk about. And that personal story that you saw in the national final version of his speech that was like in every version of his speech going back to summer. But the articulation of the topic was way too vague. He had to change everything around it. He had to change the language. And so everything around it ended up changing. And so then the articulation of the topic or of the story ended up being much more pointed by the end of the year. But he had to go through that loop a lot of times. Now, for a lot of students, you might end up having to pivot what your personal story is or pivot what your mindset is entirely. But that doesn't mean that all of your work was for waste. I see the starting bit as getting a lot of bad ideas out of the way as you get closer and closer to something meaningful that you're actually trying to articulate. And so oftentimes you should be listening to your intuition of why was I drawn to this topic, and keep just digging deeper into what you were trying to say. And oftentimes you'll get there. It is a difficult process, though. I see it as chiseling, like you're trying to create a sculpture. Imagine you have a giant bit of rock, right? And you're going to chisel this beautiful sculpture out of it. What you need to do is start chiseling away. And at first it's not going to look like anything, right? Like you're going to go through a few iterations where it doesn't look like a beautiful statue of David. But as you keep going through this iterative loop, you'll get more and more defined of what you're trying to say. And eventually you'll get to that place where it's a really well-defined sculpture and statue. So that's the goal here. And that's the mindset I think you should have. You're going to have to go through multiple iterations. You should be getting as much feedback as possible from members of the team or from coaches, so that you're getting a sense of what's working, what's not working. Try to get as much feedback, because this is an art. It's definitely not a science, right? It's not a math problem where there's an objectively correct answer. It's oftentimes hard to have a good sense just from like a 1-sentence explanation of a mindset, whether that's going to be like an absolutely hit the ball out of the park sort of speech, or whether or not we're going to have to be refining it. And so it's going to take iterations. So hopefully this video, though, helped to give you kind of an overview of all the criteria for developing a mindset, as well as a good attitude about how to go about developing this. Good luck.